Coming up, we're going to make some rocks. Well, that bell means class is in session again. Thanks for attending another Interstellar Academy. In this video, we're going to be talking about making simulated rocks. Over the last several years now, I've created some display bases and dioramas that involve making some terrain features, which include simulated rocks. And since I have some video that I captured of the display bases I created for the upcoming San Diego Comic-Con art show, I figure I'd take those clips and put them together and create a video about this particular subject. What I'd like to do now is divide the video into a few different parts. First, with regard to making the rocks, we're going to start with making some individual boulders or larger rocks, and then we'll move on to making the larger cliff faces or rock faces that I did for like the Rancor and the Y-Wing diorama. Also, I have some video of creating the display base I used for the Aang character from The Last Airbender, and so each of these video clips use different media. One uses Sculptamold to create the rocks, and the other uses air dry clay. So once I'm done with those demos, we'll get into how to paint and detail them. Let's go ahead and get started. Alright, for this demo we're going to be using this piece of Foamular as our base, and you can see I've cut some small chunks here to be used for our rocks. And as I mentioned in the past, I like using Mod Podge to seal the Foamular, so that's what we're going to do here. And the foam pieces here can be either glued on prior or after the Mod Podge, doesn't really make much difference. I'm going to go ahead and glue them in first. Got our hot glue gun here that I'll be using to attach these pieces to the base. What I like about this particular gun that I bought not too long ago is it has two settings, one low and one high. The high heat definitely melts the glue to a lot softer consistency, and that to me has helped a lot with adhesion. So I always like to mix a little paint into the Mod Podge. Sometimes I'll add in some fine terrain, as I've mentioned in the past, to add texture, but this time we'll just use the Mod Podge and paint. So to dry this, you just got to let it sit. You can use a hair dryer, or in this case, I'm going to use the food dehydrator. So let me walk that over. I'll put it in there for about 15 minutes or so, and we'll check on it. So the piece dried within about 20 minutes, and I am now ready to apply some air dry clay from Sculpey to shape the boulders. You'll probably note as I do this that the surrounding area has some texture in it, and that's because I did end up adding in some fine terrain to our Mod Podge in order to create this texture. So the Foamular is a nice base to build from, but it's important to deviate from the shape of the foam pieces as you sculpt the rocks to avoid having them look unnatural. You don't really want them to look like triangles or blocks, but instead have a very natural looking contour. Once you feel satisfied with the general shape, it's now time to use some sculpting tools like these. They have various shaped silicone heads. I prefer using the one with two flat sides, as well as the tool with the pointed tip. So as you shape and sculpt the rocks, try and create irregular and uneven surfaces, as rocks naturally have. Create peaks in some areas, and flatten some others. Now that the surface has been sculpted, it's back to the dehydrator to speed up the drying process. So the boulders are now dry after just 45 minutes in the dehydrator. Before painting them, I decided to blend away more of the area surrounding each boulder. So for painting rocks like these, I just start by choosing some sort of base color. In this case, I'll choose a blue-gray for one, a brownish red tone for the other, and a dark gray for the last one. Once fully dry, I apply a dark wash to seep into the nooks and crannies. Once that's dry, it's time to apply highlights, and this is the step that really makes it all come together, giving the simulated rocks a natural, worn, and weathered appearance. You certainly can choose a variety of colors, as most rocks have a blend of colors to them. Once the rocks are dry, there's a few other steps you can carry through. For example, you can use some of the color that you used to paint the surrounding terrain so that they appear dusted by the soil. You can also choose to dry brush some bright green to simulate moss. And another thing you can do is to add a gloss coat if you wish to make them look damp. Alright, so here are our finished rocks. I just put a little character or a little figure there just to show you how they compare to something of that scale. I think this technique results in rocks that look fairly convincing. Now, obviously you can do a lot more to blend in where the rocks meet the terrain here. What I would do is continue to work with the Mod Podge and terrain mix to fill in or build in all this area at the base of the rock so it blends in a little bit better. Alright, let's go ahead and move on now to the other tutorials. Let's first jump over to the build I did with the character from The Last Airbender, and we'll move on to what I did for the Rancor. Alright, so what we have in here is a base that I'll be using for this figure. This is the last avatar, and he came with a base that you can see here. I did 3D print this, but the way that the figure is positioned now, and I thought this was a pretty dynamic pose, but when I positioned it onto the base like that, you can notice that his face and all those details are facing down. You really don't get a good look at him. You get a good look at the top of his head. So as much as I like the pose, I don't like the base that it came with. I actually mounted the base onto here and buried it into here just so I could have a wider area. But again, if you notice, once I position him on here, he just looks straight down. So if you're looking down at him, you don't really get much view of the figure. So I thought it'd be better to create my own base, and that's what I'm doing here now. And the first step was, of course, to cut up some foam. And there's no secret to doing this. You just really are trying to get a basic shape for what you would like. And my aim here is to have the figure pointed up this way. So I went ahead and hot glued all the pieces together. And because the bottom is a bit irregular, you know, it's made up of a bunch of these chunks here of foamular, it's a bit uneven at the bottom. So what I did was I took some styrene plastic and I used 2-part epoxy to glue that to the base of the foam, and then that way I have a good amount of surface area to apply the adhesive as we put this onto the piece of wood that we're going to be using here as the base. So again, the first step is to carve out some contour and surface irregularities, and as with the first demo, I'm using this pointed pick to chip away at the foam pieces. Next, I'm sealing it here with Mod Podge, mixed with some light gray paint, and it took a little less than an hour to dry in the dehydrator. The next step now is to apply some Sculptamold. Sculptamold is described as a compound that has features of clay, plaster, and paper mache, and this compound is combined with water. It's recommended to use 2 parts Sculptamold to 1 part water, and when mixed, it has a consistency of oatmeal. Now, what I've discovered since doing this is that some modelers add in either plaster or hydrocal compound, which apparently makes it just a little easier to work with. And this is the way it ended up looking. Now, I refrained from covering the entire piece in Sculptamold because I wanted to avoid it looking like one contiguous piece. Unfortunately, it didn't look like I succeeded here. But I decided to stick with it either way, so it was time here to put it into the dehydrator, and then to add a base color when it's dried. Well, the rocks did not look quite as distinct as I wanted to, but Sculptamold is something that I still have to practice with, and yeah, my problem with it is that it makes it end up looking like one solid piece. So I really did want it to look a bit more separate, but yeah, I think it'll suffice still for our purposes here. So a base color, as you can see, has been applied, and the next step now is to move forward with a wash before adding in highlights. So again, here is the finished piece, and as you can see, I chose to use bluish tones for the rocks, and to add more definition between the rocks, I dry brushed in some darker tones. Alright, let's go now into the second demonstration here, which is the base for the Rancor vs. Luke diorama. As you may recall, the Rancor emerged from another section of the underground pit upon lifting of a gate. So my goal here was to make the cave wall to the right of the creature and the opening from which he came from. You can see this is all starting to take shape as I glue the foam pieces together. Next, it was time to turn to Mod Podge again, but this time I also mixed in some fine terrain cover for some added texture. I thought this would provide a better surface for the air dry clay to adhere to. So the next step is to apply the air dry clay, and this product again is made by Sculpey. You can find it at Michael's or Hobby Lobby. The stuff is easy to sculpt and mold, and one of the things I like the most about it is that it's very lightweight, and it also requires no time in an oven to cure. As I showed with the first demonstration, I tried to make the shapes a little different than the original foam pieces. Once the clay was on, I decided to add yet some more texture, this time using a scrubber. This is a great way to provide a fine-grained texture to the surface prior to any of the materials drying or curing. The same method can be used with Sculptamold before it fully cures. After some time in the dehydrator, this is how it ended up looking. I purposely didn't cover the entire piece just so that I could have a little bit of definition between some of the pieces. After painting, this is how the completed piece ended up looking. So I have here a piece I've created for this final part of the tutorial. This is now meant to depict a larger rock piece or rock face, and it has been now painted with a base color of gray mixed with sand. Now I've mentioned using oils with the Star Wars dioramas, but in this case, at least for this tutorial, I'm going to stick with acrylics since that is what most of you work in. The Star Wars dioramas were the first I had ever attempted with using oils, and I feel I need to refine my techniques with that medium first before passing on any information about it. Alright, well let's go ahead and get started by first applying a wash. Alright, so again the purpose of the wash is to enhance all of the little recesses and nooks and crannies there, and I want to bring those out. And we're not really going to wipe any of this off actually, we're going to just start applying the highlights and other colors just as we did with the boulders. The wash I'm using here now was made using craft paint, water, and some dishwashing liquid. Now for the ground cover, I'm actually going to pad some of this dry before putting it into the dehydrator, because that will be the next step. I just don't want quite as much here on the ground. Alright, let's go ahead and put this in the dehydrator and I'll be back in a moment. Alright, so this is what it looks like after 30 minutes now. It's fully dried, and we're ready to proceed now with painting on some highlights. So I'm going to start off with the base color first, and I'm going to dry brush that onto the peaks and high points here, and then we'll start adding in a few other colors here. Alright, this is how it ended up looking. So obviously, whether it's going to be a brighter scene, darker scene, is going to depend on the base color you start from. But this reminds me of something we might have seen on the old Star Trek series. So let me put something on here and see how well this looks as a backdrop. Well, since these rocks reminded me of the original series, I've placed this little shuttlecraft Galileo onto this display base, and I think it looks pretty good here along with a yellow sky and background. Both the simulated rocks and terrain appear to have convincing and natural texture and colors. And by the way, this little shuttlecraft is a Micro Machines miniature. If you recall, Micro Machines came out with all sorts of miniatures of the Trek ships during the heyday of the franchise. I really miss those days. Well, let's take a minute just to reminisce a little bit here and show some of the previous projects I've done in which I've attempted to make simulated rocks and terrain. Well, this here is my first diorama ever, and it is of the TWA rocket from Glencoe, shown here at a Martian base. The rocks in the background were created using plaster over styrofoam packing peanuts. Considering this was my first time doing anything like this, I thought it came out okay. But I certainly would take a different approach today and make those rocks with the techniques I've shown here. As I look at this, the other thing I would do is not cover the terrain or the ground with the type of sand used here. The scale is just way off. The grains are just too large. Instead, I would texture with that mixture of Mod Podge and fine terrain. And I was also thinking that in addition to this, it would be nice to have accumulated sand along the base of those domes. And for this, I would sculpt in the bulk of those mounds of sand, then cover them with some of the fine sand pigments available from Vallejo or MIG ammo. This is the Interceptor from UFO, and the rocks along the paths were also created in the same fashion as the Martian diorama. I think they came out a little more convincing here, but I still think it would look a little better with the air-dry clay. This now is a small diorama of the Spindrift, and the rocks here were created using epoxy putty, which is another good choice of material. I first learned to sculpt with epoxy putty, and it is really easy to work with. It can be a little more expensive, however, and of course it also requires the mixing of the two parts, which is why I've since turned to air-dry clay, since you don't have to be concerned with that. Now this is something more recent. This is from last year, and it is a little diorama of the Battlestar Galactica land ram, and this required making separate boulders. And the same thing here though, I did use epoxy putty to sculpt these boulders. Techniques that are very similar to using the air-dry clay, and to paint them I basically followed techniques I showed you here in this tutorial. And overall I think it looks pretty good. I was very happy with the way it all turned out. Alright guys, well that is going to be a wrap for now. Hope you found this of interest. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to contact me here on my YouTube channel or at interstellarmodeler@gmail.com. There goes the bell. That means class is dismissed. I will see you in the next one. Take care.